Forget Gladiator. For just a minute, erase the image of Russell Crowe, his face set in the dusty stadium light, fighting for honor, driven by noble revenge. Erase the notion of a high-minded contest, a sport of champions. It's a lie. A beautiful cinematic lie, but a romantic distortion at its core. The truth, as it always is messier, darker, and far more politically calculated. The icon of Roman brutalism, the gladiator, wasn't born from a desire for glory. He was born from the ritual of blood sacrifice. At a funeral. It didn't begin in the marble grandeur of the Colosseum. It began in the mud and stench of a cattle market. The year is 264 BC. We are in the Forum Boreum by the Tiber River. This isn't the tourist hub. It's a loud, filthy, chaotic market, the air thick with the smell of livestock, raw hides, and smoke. An important man, Decimus Junius Brutus Para, has died. His sons are doing their duty. But this isn't a funeral you or I would recognize. No soft eulogies, no somber organ music. Instead, a space is cleared. 3 pairs of slaves are shoved into it. They are armed, and they are ordered to hack each other to death. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't sport. This was a munus, a duty, a debt to be paid. To the early Roman mind, heavily influenced by their mysterious Etruscan neighbors, the spirit of a great man didn't just pass peacefully, it lingered. It was angry, and it was thirsty. It demanded blood to be appeased, to be anchored to the afterlife, to affirm its status even in death. For centuries, this might have simply meant a quick execution at the graveside. But the Romans were engineers even in their dying. They were brutally practical, and someone, at some point, had a darker, more efficient idea. Why just kill a victim? That was a waste. A simple knife to the throat was too fast, too private. Why not turn it into a contest? Why not turn the sacrifice into a performance of power, a test of will, ending in the same inevitable death? Let the spirits, and, more importantly, the living, watch a real fight. So in that cattle market, 6 men butchered each other to pacify a ghost. There was no roaring crowd of 50,000, no emperor giving a thumbs up, just a family fulfilling its grim obligation, the clang of metal, and the final gurgling gasps of the losers. It was a raw, private, religious act. It had purpose. It had meaning. And then, of course, a politician ruined it. The corruption, from duty to opportunity. It didn't take long, a generation maybe. Some ambitious Roman aristocrat stood by a tomb, watched a munus, and saw the real potential. He didn't see a religious rite, he saw an opportunity. The Roman Republic was a cramped cage of high-stakes ambition, all scrambling for power. They needed votes, suffragia. They needed public support. They needed to show off their virtus, manliness, virtue, and their largitas, generosity. The funeral became the perfect excuse. "My father has passed," a politician would announce, "and to honor his great memory, to appease his spirit, I will host a munus not of 3 pairs, I will host one of 20 pairs of gladiators." The crowd started to gather. What was once a private, somber family duty became a public spectacle. The blood was no longer being spilled for the gods of the underworld, it was being spilled for the voters in the Subura. It was the most primitive form of political advertising. The arms race began. The corruption was immediate. It was no longer about the dead, it was about advancing the careers of the living. Funeral games became an essential part of the campaign trail for any man who wanted to be consul. My rival's games were pathetic. He only had 10 pairs. Watch this. I'll give you 30, and I'll bring in captured Samnite warriors so you can watch the blood of Rome's enemies flow. The crowd, once just curious bystanders, was now an active participant. They started picking favorites. They started screaming for blood. They learned to expect it. They were being trained to crave it. The ultimate abuse. Caesar and the death of the Republic. This brutal escalation reached its insane climax with the one man who understood the optics of power better than anyone. Julius Caesar. In 65 BC, Caesar was running for a key office. He needed to make a splash, so he announced funeral games. For whom? For his father, who had been dead for 20 years. It was a transparent lie. An excuse so thin it was almost an insult. No one believed Caesar was suddenly overcome with grief. Caesar didn't care about his father's spirit, he cared about the ballot box. He planned to unleash 320 pairs of gladiators in shimmering silver armor. The scale of this was so enormous that it terrified his political rivals. They weren't afraid of Caesar's father's ghost, they were afraid of how much the mob would love Caesar for it. The Senate, in a rare fit of panic, voted to impose a limit on the number of gladiators any one man could display in Rome. They disguised it as a public safety measure. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to stop Caesar from buying the entire city. Caesar had changed the game. He had perfected the formula: mass slaughter equals public adoration. He had turned a sacred ritual into the crudest, most effective political tool ever invented. He had proven that the Roman mob would trade its loyalty to anyone who provided the most spectacular bloodletting. And then, the Republic fell. After Caesar's assassination and another bloody civil war, his grandnephew Augustus took power. Augustus, the first emperor, was a master administrator, a ruthless CEO of the empire. He was a man of systems, and he saw the danger. He couldn't have ambitious men like Caesar using the games as a private army to buy public loyalty. It was too powerful an asset to be left in private hands. It was a direct threat to his absolute power. So he did what every smart dictator does: he nationalized the industry. Augustus and the emperors who followed stripped the right to host major munera from the politicians. They made it an imperial privilege, a tool of the state. The ritual was now completely dead. Now it was an industry. And it needed a factory. In 80 AD, the Flavian Amphitheater, what we call the Colosseum, was inaugurated. It was not a temple. It was a slaughterhouse engineered with chilling precision. It could hold 50,000 spectators, arranged by social class. It had 80 entrances for crowd control. It had a complex system of elevators and trapdoors, the hypogeum, to launch wild beasts and fighters onto the arena floor as if by magic. This was state-funded infrastructure for the purpose of terror and control. Augustus had perfected the policy. Later poets would mock it as panem and chyrses, bread and circuses. But it wasn't a joke. It was policy. It was a theory of governance. A population that is fed, the free grain dole, and entertained by violence, the circus, is a population that is docile. A population addicted to brutal spectacle won't ask questions about who is rewriting the laws or who is being purged in the Senate. The final product: a machine that demands more. With the state in full control, the demand became insatiable. The simple one-on-one duel that satisfied a spirit in the cattle market was now boring. It was an appetizer. The crowd, now conditioned and desensitized by decades of escalating violence, needed novelty. They needed bigger shocks. And the imperial bureaucracy, with the limitless resources of an empire, was happy to provide. They invented the venationes, the beast hunts. This wasn't hunting, this was mass extermination. Armies were tasked with scouring the empire from North Africa to Syria to capture thousands of lions, tigers, leopards, bears, elephants, and hippos. They were caged, starved, and then unleashed in the arena to be slaughtered by professional hunters, the bestiari. At the Colosseum's opening games, 9,000 animals were killed. It wasn't sport, it was a power statement. We dominate the senators, we dominate the kings, and we dominate nature itself. They perfected the damnatio ad bestias, execution by beast. This was the midday halftime show. Criminals, deserters, and inconvenient cultists like the Christians would be tied to stakes or shoved out unarmed to be torn apart by the starving lions. It was a public service announcement. This is what happens when you cross Rome. It was state-sponsored terrorism staged as a matinee. And then the ultimate expression of insane, absolute power, the Naumachia, the mock sea battles. Caesar had started it, digging a lake near the Tiber. But later emperors did it right in the arena. They flooded the Colosseum. They brought in miniature warships, and they put thousands of Naumachari, condemned prisoners, on board and ordered them to massacre each other. This is the origin of that immortal line. As the Emperor Claudius prepared for such a spectacle, the prisoners raised their arms in salute. Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you. This wasn't a witty or formal greeting. It was the final desperate cry of men who knew they were props. They were human meat, slated to die for an